Hello, everyone, and welcome to this Dow Jones Risk and Compliance webinar. Today, we're talking about forced labor, compliance, and the supply chain. And we're going to be talking specifically about the fact that there are more laws, there are more risks, and there are definitely more complexities. Thank you all so much for joining me. I'm sat at home at the moment, reminding myself that COVID has not gone away and that these webinars are a great way to keep in touch with our clients, our community of compliance professionals. Hopefully my voice will hold out, but I've got a glass of water and I'm joined by the fantastic Anne Marie, who's going to do lots and lots of the talking. But I also want you all to participate too. There's a chat function, a Q&A function on the platform that you've all got access to. I'd love you to put questions in there for Anne Marie and I during the course of the webinar, and we'll seek to address them either as we go or at the end. If we don't get round to addressing all of your questions, I do apologize. There's a lot of people on this webinar. But we'll try and catch up with you after the event and answer your questions directly then. And yes, the webinar is being recorded. You'll be able to download it and various other pieces of material about this subject after the event. So as I said, I'm joined today by Anne Marie Lacourse. I'm Gavin Proudley. I lead the third-party risk proposition at Dow Jones. But more importantly, Anne Marie works with us on trade compliance issues and export controls issues as a specialist. And Anne Marie, you recently wrote a paper on the UFLPA, and you titled it, "Could navigating US trade restrictions be any more difficult?" I think you were channeling your friend's dialogue there. Could trade restrictions be any more difficult? But I wonder what you kind of meant by that. You've got a long history in trade compliance. Is it a really bad time right now? Is it really complicated?
It is. It's been complicated for a while, as evidenced by the various tariffs, the tit for tats, then the pandemic, supply chain, kind of the logistics upheaval, and now there's the paper addresses, in essence, this convergence between the logistics side, the trade compliance side, as well as these global mandates around compliance and logistics. And it's going to lead to a lot of supplier reshuffling. And the last time that happened, it created a lot of work. So buckle up.
Great, buckle up. Seatbelts on, and it feels like we're all doing a lot of that in different countries around the world right now. If any of our listeners are in the UK, we're buckling up for all sorts of reasons, and this is just one of them. So I wanted to kick off with a little bit of how did we get here? We're going to talk about the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act in detail and some of the other issues around that in a minute. But in a way, this isn't new. And I just wanted to really reinforce that point. Anne Marie, you and I talked previously about, where this sort of stemmed back to. And we were talking about how far back should we make this slide? And, anyone that's made presentations knows sometimes you try and fit too much information on. But it felt to us important to recognize that, this focus on forced labor really goes back, almost 100 years to that point of the formation of the International Labour Organization. And the definition that they arrived at then, is still useful to us, which is all work or service which is extracted under the menace of any penalty for its non-performance and for which the worker does not offer work voluntarily. So we've got a definition of forced labor that has been around for a long, long time. You had the 1948, the UN Declaration of Human Rights. And I know many of you will have compliance programs where aspects of your compliance programs are focused on those Declaration of Human Rights and the principles around those. Track forward many decades, 1993, the Office of the United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights established. And many of you will be aware of the reporting that that body puts out regularly about human rights situations around the world, including on forced labor. US Department of State Trafficking Victims Protection Act in 2000, an interesting act. And I think, at this point, still a lot of the legislation is around trafficking of people. But then as we track forward into more recent times, the legislation really starts to focus in on forced labor within organizations' supply chain. Anne Marie, you're based in DC. Pick it up from that sort of period of what's happening in the US and the sort of acceleration through from 2016 onwards.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think it was the Magnitsky case, and that essentially brought the idea of human rights generally into trade, and that act was global. Similar measures were passed in EU, Canada, UK, Australia between 2017 and 2020. And they all had very noble, lofty goals, but some teeth were really put into those rules as well, sometimes by statute, sometimes by just enforcement practice. In 2020 in the US, an interagency task force was essentially carved out and codified into a preferential or free trade program, which was pretty unique for those of us in trade that live, the supply chains follow trade agreements. So having a task force codified into a preferential program and then established, essentially and funded and mandated through executive order. That interagency task force we have today, it is extremely active, and it is mandated to monitor imports and the prohibition on goods made with forced labor. In 2000, we also had Commerce, the Department of Commerce, BIS, that became more active through list-based end use controls, very specific licensing policies that allowed BIS to review even specific transactions for concerns about human rights. So you'll, think about the reasons for control. These are primarily what you'll find in crime control, water cannon, surveillance equipment, and then of course, the ever-present entity list designations. 2020 was a hopping year for a number of reasons, but that's also when XPCC was sanctioned. And that is, of course, the Xinjiang Production and Construction Corps. XPCC is a gracious name for it. Originally, there were some sector-wide controls, cotton, tomato, hair products, and downstream products that originated primarily with those goods. But what's interesting for those that were not necessarily in those types of goods, XPCC is massive. It's a Beijing funded conglomerate. It's in, 70 or so really varied industries. It's present with actual ongoing commercial business activities in every continent And it was at the time, and still is today, the most expansive global entity ever sanctioned by the US. So it was a bit of a wake-up call if you were paying attention. And if you weren't, then the Uyghur Forced Labor Act that was enacted, enforcement is happening. It's the focus of why we're here today. And it is, went into force right before, as Gavin mentioned, the human rights, the High Commissioner for Human Rights issued really essentially a scathing assessment confirming human rights violations and concerns in Xinjiang, which I think was the impetus to really move forward in the EU and other countries with regulations that are essentially creating a more multilateral forced labor regime type of control, so that products that are prohibited generally from circulation, whether that's intra-EU, import, export, and frankly, what the EU has proposed is far more expansive.
Yeah. And we'll come on to talk about that later in the webinar. I think one of the really interesting things for me to observe from this timeline is the shift in the focus of the world of trade compliance from export controls, i.e. where your product is going to, and being careful that that product doesn't go to an entity or organization or jurisdiction where it could be used in breach of human rights. A shift from that to not just where is the product going to, but where are your products from, and what constitutes your supply chain with respect to human rights. So I think that's a really important shift that many of our clients and organizations and people who are on this webinar are probably dealing with, because it's often a different set of people within an organization. Those that are managing a supply chain might not be as familiar with or comfortable with that level of sort of due diligence and checks as someone who is thinking about where is the product going. And I think that's a really important shift that's happened over the past 10 or so years. And it happens in the context as well, let's be honest, that of broader geographic tensions or political tensions rather between China particularly and the US that are played out in various trade restrictions and trade controls. And in that way, I wanted just to kind of, as well as placing us in time, I wanted to place us on the map, because people hear that, well, what is it, XUAR, people hear us referring to Xinjiang. I wanted just to be, make sure everyone is clear, where are we talking about? And the reason for that is because it is such a strategically important place for China in many respects, but also for supply chains in many respects. This is a part of China which borders many other countries where organizations might perceive there to be risks, might perceive there to be bribery and corruption risks, for example, or money laundering risks, and of course, including human rights risks as well. So the region is in a what might be described as a high risk area. It's also right bang in the middle of the Belt and Road Initiative, and it's absolutely key to that that initiative by China to create trade routes through a whole number of countries where China has invested hugely in the infrastructure and in supporting trade in and through those jurisdictions, with the aim of ensuring solid export control routes and, of course, import control routes for its own products. So this Xinjiang region is in a really important place geographically. But what's occurred to me as we've been looking at this is also just how important it is economically in terms of many organizations' supply chains, and just how critical it is for certain products. There's a few things listed here, Anne Marie. Do you want to talk through, why is this place so important?
Well, it's not just your everyday geographic risk, whether that's, diversion, illicit trafficking. There, as you mentioned, the sphere of Chinese influence is very important. The types of products that come from the region are varied, they're substantial. And the finished goods, as well as those raw materials that are flowing from Xinjiang, flow into every province in China, whether it's for secondary manufacturing, consumption, which means that the risk of UFLPA compliance has essentially spread to every port in China. And for many of the folks with us today, more importantly, has spread to a tremendous number of HTS chapters that are far more.
HTS?
Yeah, the harmonized tariff system.
Thank
so
you.
the types of products that are.
Most people on the call will know what an HTS is and an ECCN, but I just want to make sure we always spell it out.
No, yeah, that's the types of products are really, really varied. And, consider that 2019 and 2020 exports from Xinjiang totaled roughly 18 billion. And direct imports went to declared imports from Xinjiang was at 177 different countries. And those are the last time, that was the last time plausible trade statistics were available for us. But it's, those goods are still going somewhere. They're just, becoming a little bit more risky in terms of declaring exactly where they're from.
Got it. And the mention here of, for example, half of the world's supply of polysilicon used in solar panels and semiconductors.
Mm-hmm. That's big deal.
These are big chunks of organizations, resources or sources of their supply chain.
Mm-hmm.
So when we talk about disruption to supply chain happening, and in fact, I saw the World Trade Organization is meeting today in Geneva, and the opening panel was talking about the world we're in, and it was just interesting hearing the General Secretary there just talking about this. We are in a very different time where disruption is the norm, and the level of disruption is just unprecedented. And I know that word gets used to, but it really is. So you're taking out half of the world's supply of polysilicon in putting it into an area where it's really difficult to do business with that area, then you're causing a big problem for people who are manufacturing solar panels, semiconductors, etc.
Right. Yeah. Product sets that were already facing quite a bit of disruption are even more so now, right?
Yeah. So listen, we've talked about how we got here in terms of time. We've just placed ourselves on the map to understand where we're talking about. I want to get into the detail of the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act, UFLPA. When I describe it, I think sometimes I say it's a pretty simple act, because it basically says, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, Anne Marie, but I think it basically says anything that is made in this region, we, the US government, believe it is made with forced labor, and therefore it is not allowed into the United States. Oh, and we've added some other companies on here as well, which we also think are involved in forced labor, and we're listing them here in BIS entity list. So you can't bring anything in from those companies either. Is it that simple? Is it basically we think everything made here is at high risk of being made with forced labor, therefore it can't come into the US? It feels to me there isn't that much more to it, apart from obviously what we're going to go on to talk about, which is, okay, if you want to prove us wrong, if you want to rebut this presumption, then here's what you've got to do. Would you describe it as a simple act, or is it highly complex?
It is. Frankly, reading the rules, reading the guidance, and the multi-agency task force, basically implementation guidance is light reading compared to typical trade regulations. It is that easy. Where it gets fun is around trying to comply with that. So basically,
well,
you're spot on.
Let's talk about that then. Let's talk about how you comply with this, because I think that if I'm a sourcing, manager in an organization in the US, and we should say at this point, this is US legislation. So when I talk about the government's assumption that it's forced by the US government, we'll come on to talk about the EU and other jurisdictions in a minute. Don't worry, everyone. But if I'm a sourcing manager in a company in the US, and I am previously sourcing from a company in the Xinjiang Uyghur Autonomous Region, it feels to me I've got two options. Option one, which is definitely my preferred option because it's easier, is I'm just going to turn that off. I'm going to switch that off and not import from that jurisdiction, that region, because life is too complicated. And that I'm sure, and you probably know of organizations that have said to you, we're just turning it off. The other option is, no, I believe that the organization or the entity I'm dealing with in this region is not using forced labor. And I believe that I can prove that that is the case to the US Customs and Border Protection authorities, and I'm going to do that. Are those my two options? Firstly, and then secondly, what do I have to do to prove that there isn't forced labor?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, leave it to someone in the financial crime sector to think that this is easy, but it's okay, Gavin. It really is that, you are right. Do not import goods that come from this region, which in and of itself means that the 470,000 companies located in that region, you'll need to find another supplier or vendor for. So vendor and supplier security within corporates is, definitely a hop in place these days. And then, yes, you can, if you are, if you do have operations in Xinjiang, you have probably already begun to build or have substantial controls in place to make sure that you're not tainting your supply chain with the misbehavior identified within the UN, within the UN forced labor report, or worse, some of the, criminal and human rights types of activities that are, documented, and really what brought along this type of rule. But where it gets a lot more complicated, even just in terms of trying to comply with the rebuttable or trying to build the case, clear and convincing evidence, is around the commingling of products. So goods, materials from Xinjiang has long been commingled product, going to other regions, 177 countries, that just naturally, because of the way supply chains and manufacturing work, obscure the origin of materials that go into finished goods. So companies that purchase raw or processed goods from third companies are at risk, absolutely, of indirectly procuring goods produced with forced labor. If I know this, and now all of you know this, who else do you think knows that? Well, the government. So basically, they're well aware. XPCC, we talked about them a little bit earlier. CBP has hundreds of documented cases of evasion of laws, sanctions, as well as export controls from transshipments. Transshipments would be goods that are produced in one country but shipped to another, and a new bill of lading is generated in order to look as though the goods are originating from a transshipped country.
Got it. And so because there's a question come in about that it goes beyond just imports from Xinjiang region, but also if the raw materials came from there, and then, as you say, they're commingled, then there's a problem. Which is so in order to, if you really wanted to comply, you've got to get this, and it's an exception, not a license. So, an important point, this doesn't give you permission to do this on an ongoing basis. It's a one-off exception to the rules. You've got to present the full mapping of your supply chain. You've got to demonstrate the level of governance that exists across that supply chain. You've got to comply with the forced labor task force, enforcement task force guidance, and you've got to comply with the Customs and Border Protection, the CBP requirements. I mean, what's in there that what do organizations need to do to build up that dossier of evidence?
Well, that's it. They must trace the routing and sourcing for all the inputs into their bills of material. This is especially true for high-risk items, but it's really all goods. So given third-party manufacturing, secondary manufacturing, it's going to be hard, but there is certainly a lot more publicly available information that can make supply chain mapping less boots on the ground and more research-based, based on ownership, control, supply chain connections. So, suppliers, second and third tiers, being able to map that out is, yes, hard. The pandemic certainly brought the fact that supply chain management, trade compliance, operations is incredibly hard. But it brought that into our living room on the news, and, the lack of things on the store shelf. But I think it also brought it into the boardroom. And that is exactly the level of attention that's going to need to be paid in order to do the things that you just mentioned, have governance,
Yep.
make sure you're properly staffed to support both ongoing trade operations as well as all the activities to map out your supplier risk, your supplier risk, if there, where there may be some, but it's that supply chain visibility.
Got it. And we're gonna come on to talk about sort of more general management of these risks in association with this act in a second. But I just wanted to pull out some figures. I think we're in the Wall Street Journal either today or yesterday from Department of Homeland Security. Almost 1,500 cargo entries detained or reviewed by the Customs Border Police, valuing $429 million so far.
Mm-hmm.
That's, this has been in force for what, a couple of months, if that.
Right.
This is an act which it feels to me that the US government is very committed to enforcement.
Yes, absolutely. The fact that some of these statistics are being released by CBP at all is really unparalleled in terms of their enforcement efforts. They like to be less open about what they're gonna, worry about enforcing, so that they can continue on with investigations, etc. So the statistic that you just read is really impactful, especially considering that between October 2021 to June 30th of this year, only a little over 2,000 shipments were detained. So for 1,400 to be detained in the last 3 months versus the previous 10 months, and the dollar amounts that we're talking about are big. There's a lot of consumer goods companies, apparel companies here with us today, so you may not appreciate the very recent statistic from Fortune magazine, which believes that seizure orders will disqualify $20 billion in apparel sales in the US.
Wow.
That's significant. And disqualify meaning that's not even everything you've managed to keep from coming here. Those are goods that have arrived, whether pre-manifest disclosures, or you're at customs waiting to clear. $20 billion is what they're estimated to refuse entry to and to seize. So yes, Gavin, given the enforcement environment, there is no time like the present, if you haven't already, to begin to build that clear and convincing evidence, which is the only thing that will rebut that presumption of forced labor. And the only way to even have a chance that your evidence will be clear and convincing is to have full visibility into your supply chains, build that, move the suppliers that you need to move, document.
And so what we've got here is 8 recommendations from the Forced Labor Enforcement Task Force as being the kind of things that organizations should be doing. So I'm a company that does not import from the XUAR, from that region. I'm confident that I've kind of not got suppliers who are recently named on BIS entity lists as being in breach of human rights. But I need to make sure that I'm managing risks and aren't inadvertently exposed to shipments that include products, goods, etc., from that region. Talk me through. These are the kind of things that I should be doing. Is that right? Is that what FLETF is saying?
Yep. And we have included as part of this webinar links to the government documents that are written in pretty clear language. Again, they're short, they're sweet, they're easy to understand. These 8 steps are true for you even if you don't intend to rebut the presumption of forced labor. So in order to comply with UFLPA, you must have visibility into your supply chains and document all the inputs into your supply chain, both commodity and the entities that are supplying the commodities to your supply chain. So it's not just those that want to rebut the presumption, it's everyone that is importing into the US. So that's pretty big. And if I were still managing supply chains, I would absolutely go about these steps in in a very particular order because they make the most sense. Corral your stakeholders, your supply chain partners, decide which ones you may not really be able to document out, and you may just have to not do business with them anymore. You will need to do due diligence. It couldn't be more clear from the enforcement effort, from CBP directly, from the multi-agency task force, what's going to be required in the EU, what's already required under the German Supply Chain Due Diligence Act. Heightened due diligence, meaning know and assess your risks and impacts. So boards everywhere, corporate boards, those of you that are the attorneys for corporate boards, those of you that support, basically the talking points or the background information for boards, you're well aware that they are being called upon by shareholders, by insurance companies, by their bankers to prepare documented public reports to the extent that the company protects workers in its supply chain, protects the supply chain, and those of its suppliers from forced labor. That's really twofold. That's geography. So the locations and the identities of entities in your supply chain, but you also need to know the business relationships among the entities in the supply chain. So that's not just your standard restricted party screening. Those days have been over for a while, but this really brings those business relationships to the forefront. As I mentioned before, Gavin, there are documented 480,000 companies doing business, most of which is export or raw material to be used in the manufacture of goods in Xinjiang. So that's great. It's why your supplier code of conduct, just drafting something up and posting it in the employee break room is just not going to cut it. It needs to, really be real, and you're going to need to monitor it. So this isn't a one and done. So by, in order to keep yourself in compliance, keep the risk of forced labor out of your supply chain, you're going to need to continually keep up to date on locations, identities of entities in their business relationships. Procurement teams are going to be really busy. Obviously the government's going to make you remediate violations, your insurance companies, an independent review. I've always been of the mind that another pair of eyes, sometimes depending on the complexity of your supply chain, we've always liked to have 2 different third parties review information and make sure everyone is coming to the same, conclusion, because you will have to absolutely demonstrate that you've implemented everything that you've said that you're doing, and that it's effective.
Do you think this is is this a paradigm shift for trade compliance teams as they relate to supply chain. This is the moment, like in the sort of, I don't know, I'm thinking when really aggressive enforcement of FCPA started in, sort of post 2004, 2005, there was a real shift in how organizations were approaching anti-corruption. Obviously, recently, since February and the invasion of Ukraine, or the more substantial invasion of Ukraine, I should say, the focus on sanctions has been front of mind for organizations and ensuring compliance with those regimes. Are we now in a sort of a real shift for trade compliance teams where this just represents a different way of working with their supply chain?
I love that analogy, Gavin, because it really is spot on. Just like those in FI compliance, financial compliance, insurance compliance, those of us in trade operations, we know when enforcement is posing as something that it's not really, and when enforcement really is enforcement, and that it is being taken seriously. It is a paradigm shift. This is this is not just here to stay, which means you must do these things, but the stakes are high.
Yep.
As they were in FCPA, there were, obviously corruption requirements long before FCPA.
Yeah, 1984 or something, the FCPA.
Yes.
Yeah.
But I mean, the enforcement, the real true teeth about making sure you genuinely, day in, day out, better not be doing any of this or any hint of doing this. We don't really, necessarily touch on whistleblower statutes, but what I'm hearing around whistleblower payouts for reports of forced labor in supply chains should make everyone very nervous. The insurance industry is positively in a panic about them. So yes, Gavin, a resounding yes. It's a paradigm shift.
Right. And so we've got links in the handouts, everyone, to some of these recommendations and various documents. And obviously, you can always reach out to Anne Marie and myself at Dow Jones if you want further information. There are loads of questions coming in, and I'm going to try and get to lots of them. But before I start addressing some of these questions, I want us to move a little bit away from the US. One of the questions that's come in is it relates to new legislation working its way through the Canadian system around modern slavery, forced labor. And I know you've mentioned the German Supply Chain Act, the German word for which I'm not going to pronounce, but I say it is one word rather than three words. But there's also regulations going through the EU. This isn't something that is just affecting US companies operating within the jurisdiction of US border force. This isn't an issue that is just affecting organizations looking to import goods actually from China. I mean, this is an issue around forced labor, which has been working its way through national governments and legislatures and other institutions for many decades. But, you look at things like the Australian Modern Slavery Act, UK Modern Slavery Act, legislation is now putting much stronger burden on organizations to have in place their own, ensure protection of their own staff, obviously, and fair treatment of those staff, but also to look across their supply chain or their value chain as well, through to their customers as well, and ensure that individuals across that value chain are being treated fairly and are not subject to forced labor or other things. Many of you will have seen a report came out earlier this month, Global Estimates of Modern Slavery. And I think this came out with a view that there were nearly 30 million people in forced labor, 27.6 or something like that, in forced labor. So it is a really big issue, and it's aligning with a broader focus on ESG, environmental, social, governance issues. Anne Marie, can you talk a little bit about what you're seeing across the EU? I think you mentioned earlier that actually, and I can't believe it, but are the regulations going to be even more stringent than the UFLPA?
Mm-hmm. You heard right. The kind of the draft ban on goods tainted with forced labor. And just to be clear, we do not yet have anywhere de minimis calculations that you can do to untaint your finished good. Any amount of forced labor renders the entire good as forced labor, and the EU is certainly, has adopted that stance. So the EU rule is going to affect imports and exports. It affects intra-EU commerce, and essentially all goods that are already in the country. So there's no savings clause with respect to goods that are in inventory. And picking up with, this idea of ESG, which, is kind of the new way of just addressing the fact that what I mentioned kind of at the outset is that we, as kind of global supply chain resiliency, ensuring that there's redundancy built into, the corporate goals that the supply chain has is great. But as the new ILO, International Labor Organization standards show us, what's really at stake here is, yes, the 30 million people that are in forced labor, that forced labor is growing. They found that right around 3 million more people are in forced labor from the last report than today. And no region of the world is spared from forced labor. So it's everywhere. It's not just tomatoes and cotton and, solar panels. The other very interesting detail in there that maps back directly for those of you that are thinking about whether or not you should begin to run state-owned entity screening. State-imposed forced labor is 14% of that 30 million. That is really shocking. We've gone from where it was pretty much commercially driven greed, just humans acting badly, to governments truly having this as a commercial input to their GDP. It's just really tragic. So yes, Gavin, the EU is essentially picking up on that, which is why it covers all products, no matter the place that it occurs in the supply chain, and no matter the type of product. They're not suggesting that there will be a UFLPA-ish entity list.
Yep.
It's any company, and we'll see. We'll see what the standard is by which enforcement mechanisms will come into play. But almost certainly it will include all the products in the U.S. labor, the Department of Labor, forced labor guide, which is published every 2 years. And it's kind of the Bible in supply chain, if you will, as to for procurements, especially. Purchasing this type of product from this country exposes us to forced labor risk. And that includes governments, where to buy coal, where to buy some more, types of materials that aren't the typical things going across supply chains. Trash, the importation and the exportation of trash is actually really big business. And that's something that, of course, it is definitely implicated in these various reports.
Got it. Just mention the name of that document again, because a lot of people on the will want to look it up.
We have a link to it, fortunately, because I'm not really 100% sure of the name.
Right, got it. It's in the handout.
It's the Department of Labor forced labor report.
Yeah.
It will automatically come up.
Perfect. I'm gonna try and get to some of these questions now, because there's tons coming in. One of the questions I'll answer straight away was around whether or not aspects of this will be added into the Dow Jones risk and compliance data. So when an organization is named by, for example, the BIS on its entity list, then automatically that organization gets added to our data. So if a company is named, and we talked about earlier how the UFLPA names both a region and specific companies. So if companies are named, then yes, they go on the list. I think the broader point here, though, is that Anne Marie is talking about is the need for that sort of risk-based approach to due diligence, to understand where your real risks are within your supply chain, and whether it's on a list or not, to know the origins of that relationship and the nature of that relationship and the goods and products that are flowing through that relationship, and whether or not you're exposed to any risks through it. So the lists are great, and we will keep our lists up to date as US regulations, EU regulations, and others change, but they're not the end. They're a great starting point. They're not the end. There's a number of questions about that all sort of go around a similar theme, Anne Marie, which is how different legislation interacts with each other. So, for example, the United States, Mexico, Canada Agreement, USMCA, how that interacts with UFLPA. So, there are bilateral trade relationships, there are multilateral trading relationships, and then we have unilateral trade restrictions and trade controls. Can you describe a little bit the life of a trade compliance officer in an organization, how she or he kind of navigates all of this?
Mm-hmm. Carefully. And yes, so the idea of UFLPA, forced labor inside trade agreements, is really pretty novel. So whether or not you're looking for, that certificate of origin in order to perform qualification, whether it's averaging under USMCA or whether it is going to be qualification on, a BOM specific basis, bill of material basis. The idea of qualification means that your supplier's inputs that go into your qualification, that go into your landed cost calculations, that go into the labor, that average hourly wage calculation, none of the parties or the products that go into the calculations for obtaining tariff or duty relief under this, trade mechanism, free trade mechanism, can be used. So in order to know that, in order to not use a company or a product in your calculations, you're going to need to make sure that you comply with UFLPA first, that there aren't any organizations that are manufacturing for you, whether that is your tier 2, tier 3, tier 4. There isn't a limit in USMCA as to how far you need to go down. And again, that's true under direct calculations as well as averaging for qualification. The second part of Gavin's question, I really appreciate, because this is why you want to make sure you have really, really good trade compliance people embedded into your supply chain, because deconfliction with rules that contradict each other, what do you do, is something that would take, hours to really talk about, because it depends on a number of factors, but it's deconfliction.
Yep.
And making sure that you're abiding by all the rules, but you have to keep your business moving simultaneously. And at the risk of sounding a bit like a broken record, part of the way that you make your deconfliction decisions is going to be based on what you find out about your suppliers. You may decide that a supplier that seems to have just too many connections back to China generally is just not something that you can take on today. And you just need to move the products that you're, that you're buying or building, the inputs to what you're buying or building, move it out of geographies that cause you to need to deconflict.
I'm going to take one more question. We've got 45 seconds to answer it. So you're going to go back to, do you remember that time when you were working at JP Morgan? You do, I'm sure. So, so you're going to go back, you're in a bank. As a financial institution, what is your responsibilities with respect to, your trade finance team are supporting actions. To what extent are you worried about UFLPA as a financial institution?
They need to make sure they're not financing in any way forced labor. And they're going to certainly, as we already know, undertaking very significant steps to look for this in their financial supply chain, with the same types of due diligence, supplier due diligence, enhanced supplier due diligence, mapping of the types of supplier relationships, geography relationships, and they're starting to do that. You definitely do not want your bank contacting you to withhold financing. Another good reason to make sure you have your clear and convincing evidence, because it may not be CBP that you need to convince. It may be your bankers, your insurance companies, your leadership team within FIs, the board, corporates, etc.
So we've talked about how we got here. We talked about where we're talking about. We talked about the details of UFLPA and managing the ongoing risks. And we talked about where we're going. Feels to me the key message is this issue around forced labor in particular is very much here to stay. I read Robert Silver's Undersecretary of the Department of Homeland Security saying this is a top tier board level compliance issue. So when the Department of Homeland Security tells you that, whether you're a US company or not, you sit up and listen. I made a mistake earlier. I said about FCPA coming out in 1984. It was 1977. Of course, Purple Rain was 1984. That was the only thing that happened in 1984, Purple Rain. Listen, thank you everyone so much. Thank you, Anne Marie, for all your insights. I'm sorry we didn't get to all of your questions. There were far too many. We'll try and
we will.
Exactly. We'll answer them after this. So thank you all and have a nice rest of your day.